Okay, I think that we are gonna start. This is third roundtable of the conference, and it's the freshest addition to the program, and it's also probably something that's very dear to many hearts here, but also something that is of a methodological point that has been the red line through, or red thread through much of the conversations. So we're going to try to focus some of the discussions on different aspects of new collaborations. New collaborations can mean many different things, but one thing seems certain at this point to me, which is that unless we figure out a different way of working, another way of collaborating, or unless we multiply ways of collaborating across different boundaries, whether they are language, discipline, country, institution, then it's going to be difficult to do things better or do things differently, right? So there is certain plumbing that needs to be put in place before we can actually meaningfully project ourselves towards 2073, right? So there is that aspect of it. And today I'm very fortunate to have with us three very experienced practitioners of collaboration, right? They come from different institutions, different continents, but also these are people who have spent better part of last 10 years collaborating with people outside of their field, language, specialty, discipline, you name it, they've done it. So I'm gonna, without further ado, just quickly introduce Rebekah Clements, who needs no introduction at this conference. She is the researcher at ICREA, which is the Catalan CNRS, and she's also based at the University of Barcelona, Free University of Barcelona, with a project on early modern Japan, funded by the European Research Council, called The Aftermath, this little war that happened in East Asia, which was 17 times bigger than the Spanish and modern Asia. So we know about that. Éric Mermet is a CNRS research engineer who has done a PhD in data, analyzing of spatial data. He has a deep passion for graphs. And he's the head of the computational unit at the Toulouse School of Economics. Previously, he has helped found a platform of géomatique, which is French way of saying GIS, at the EHESS, and has run that very successfully for about 10 years. I may be talking about loud. Okay, I'm going to speak louder. They rarely ask me to do that. So Éric Mermet was a data analyst who spent 10 years building a project at the EHESS. And Sarah Teasley, who has previously been the head of Department of Design History at Royal Academy of Art, Royal College of Art, and is now translated to Melbourne, where she works at RMIT as a professor. She combines social science and research design, and she flew all the way from Melbourne to share thoughts on collaboration, which she has done successfully with both political leaders, practitioners, researchers, and community activists of the last 20 years. So without further ado, I leave the floor to, in the order of appearance, Rebekah Clements, Éric Mermet, and Sarah Teasley.
Thank you very much, Aleksandra. So today I'm going to introduce is this loud enough? I hope so. I'm going to introduce the theme of collaboration, and we'll each talk briefly on one of these three themes, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards before opening up to questions. I'll talk briefly about some of the good things about collaborating and some of the challenges. And this is based largely on this project that I've been running. It's entering its 5th and final year now. We were able to get an extension of the usual 4-year period to 5. It's, as everybody here already knows, the aftermath of the East Asian War project, and it involves a team of, it fluctuates because we have been very fortunate in that people have been able to go on and get permanent jobs. So at the moment we have 5 members and we have 3 former members who've gone on to get other positions but who continue to collaborate with us. And it's been, I have to say, an absolute joy collaborating. And I also want to acknowledge that collaboration is not necessarily new to historians. It's not new to many people here who work in social sciences or anthropology. But for me as an early modern historian, it's not, I would say, the standard working model. But I have found it to be just so inspiring and so encouraging. And it was particularly good, as I mentioned in my talk yesterday, during COVID, to be able to find new ways of continuing to connect with the scholarly community. And also, in a small way, we were hoping to also support that community. And so, I mean, we all collaborate anyway, even if we don't have collaboration built in as a publication model in our fields. We talk to colleagues, we go to conferences, we present our research, and we get feedback. And when you collaborate with someone more closely on a particular publication, you get a more intense version of that. And I've just found that we've been able to do some really, to me, very exciting work that would not have got done otherwise. So I'll give you a few examples of that. We have this, well, this is perhaps not terribly exciting, but I hope it's useful. The Aftermath project was founded with the idea that we wanted to encourage cross-language interaction between scholars who work in Chinese history, Korean history, and Japanese history, and the growing number of scholars who work in European languages on the Imjin War. So we set up this database, and it was supposed to be launched at the end of the project, but COVID sped it up because we weren't able to do field work, so we had to switch to doing other things. And so we've got around, I think, over 800 sources in 10 languages, and you can search by language, you can search by subject area, just to get an idea of what people are publishing. Now, I know some people are using this. I think people still tend to look for sources in their own language, but if you want to know who's a very major publisher in Korean, for example, on your particular topic, this is where I would recommend people start, where people go. And then you can reach out to that person, and that gives opportunities for collaboration. So it's our hope that in the coming years that will become more of a resource for people who work on this question, or people who work on the question of the influence of this war in East Asia, and that covers quite a wide range of topics. We're not just talking about military history. Another fun thing we did during the pandemic was this website which it tells the stories of the Korean potters who came to Tokugawa, Japan, or were brought to Tokugawa, Japan during and shortly after the Imjin War. And I collaborated with Dr. Soyoung Sang, who is a ceramic historian who works on Korea and Japan. And you can see this. We wanted to make these images available because we were aware that during the pandemic, access to art galleries and museums was curtailed, and that it was also very difficult for people who were teaching and having to put all their teaching online. So we also made some, on the resources page, you can see we do some downloadable worksheets for educators. Anyway, that's now, when it comes, let's talk about some of the challenges and the downsides. I think I've been quite fortunate that I haven't found any of the challenges to be personality based, although I can imagine that, that can be an issue. What I have found, one of the biggest challenges is actually finding somewhere to publish research that is cross-disciplinary or cross-linguistic, because journals tend to be set up with a particular traditional model in mind. That work that I presented yesterday on on the Jesuit document, it was very difficult to find somewhere to publish that because the people who are experts on Iberian sources don't need a translation, and many Asian studies journals don't really publish translations anymore. So we were sort of stuck, but we eventually found somewhere to publish it. Another issue I'd like to highlight is how do you give people credit for the work they do on a collaboration? What is the ethical best practice for doing that? And this is a model that the sciences have worked very well at doing, and they have their norms and their best practices. But at least in history research, in pre-modern Japanese history, we don't have, as far as I'm aware, any published ethical guidelines, and it's very uncommon to collaborate unless you're doing an edited volume. That's a sort of, people understand how that works. This is changing. There's a project called Living with Machines, which is a UK research funded large project in the humanities, and they have come up against this, and they have published a monograph, Collaborative Historical Research in the Age of Big Data, which is available open access. And you can read about some of these. They thought about the way to do these kinds of collaborations, but particularly how to acknowledge the work that people do on your collaboration. So as another concrete example of this, this is an article that I wrote with my PhD student for the Imjin War project. And I think it highlights some of the pitfalls that we have to be careful about when we're doing collaborative work, particularly with our students, because I think there's probably a reluctance to tread on their territory or to steal their ideas. And if you do co-author an article, you have to be very careful that it's, in my opinion, that it's completely to the advantage of the student to do that collaboration. So this was a chapter of the dissertation that my student decided not to include in the dissertation because it became more about epidemics, her dissertation, and this was about timber. And it was also written at a very early stage of her PhD where she has modern Japanese, but she hadn't really had the practical experience with pre-modern Japanese sources, and this particular topic required Chinese, Korean, and Japanese. So she had Chinese and Korean, but not the Japanese. So I brought that Japanese in, and also we were able to work on the norms of English language publishing and scholarship, and so it became a kind of training exercise for her. Now you'll notice we've got first author and second author. I don't know whether that means anything to people here. I assume it does. In the sciences, it very clearly marks that this person is the main author. And that this person is, sometimes in the sciences, that person is just the supervisor or the PI. In the humanities, you'll often see that that's the person who did the most work, and this is the secondary person. So in this case, if you're working with a student, I would be very wary of ever being the first author on that paper, unless it was very clearly my work and the student had helped and I wanted to acknowledge that. But in this case, it was her work. And so, but I was able to be the corresponding author with the journal and walk her through the norms of how you talk to an academic journal, how do you do the review process, things like that. So it became a training exercise, as well as producing a piece of research that would otherwise not have been possible. And actually, I'm really pleased to say it won an award from the Society for Military History, a Van der Walt Prize last year, which again was very good for the student. She was able to put that on her CV. So I think I'm going to stop here and hand over to the next speaker, but I'm happy to take questions on this afterwards. Thank you.
Bonjour. Bonjour à toutes et tous. Mon intervention sera en français. Je vais essayer d'être assez clair. Donc, je suis Éric Mermet, je suis ingénieur de recherche. Je fais du calcul scientifique. On va dire que je suis data scientist pour élargir un petit peu. J'ai fait beaucoup de SIG. Je suis tombé dans les humanités numériques parce que j'ai eu un bout de carrière à l'école des hautes études en sciences sociales. Aujourd'hui, je suis donc à l'école d'économie de Toulouse, où je suis alors responsable de la plateforme de calcul scientifique, et on y reviendra, c'est pour ça que je le mentionne, délégué à la protection des données. Peut-être que ça peut être intéressant à mentionner. Habituellement, moi, ce que je fais, c'est que je construis des outils, donc j'ai une vision, on va dire, très ingénieure de la chose. Et ce que je vous propose aujourd'hui, c'est d'avoir une espèce de retour un peu réflexif sur les outils que je construis. Et ma présentation s'intitule comment casser les frontières, justement, et déjà tenter d'identifier les frontières qu'on va essayer de déceler en fait dans toute une chaîne de production de la donnée. Alors quelques mots sur les humanités numériques, là simplement en regardant ce matin ce qui se passe dans la communauté des humanités numériques, j'ai constaté quelque chose d'assez intéressant. Là, c'est cette espèce d'aplatissement sur les citations en humanité numérique. Alors en haut, il y a la version, on va dire, internationale en langue anglaise. Donc on est de l'ordre de la centaine de milliers. Ensuite, en dessous, on a vraiment le mot-clé humanité numérique, donc en langue française. Et on constate qu'il y a une espèce d'aplatissement. Alors ça ne veut pas forcément dire que les humanités numériques se fatiguent, en tout cas qu'il y a un désintérêt pour la discipline. À mon sens, les humanités numériques commencent à prendre plusieurs formes, et ça a été évoqué, on parle d'interdisciplinarité, pardon. Et donc elle se dissémine un petit peu partout. À mon avis, c'est ce qui est en train de se passer. Je le vois au travers des multiples projets que j'accompagne. C'est mon travail d'accompagner des projets de recherche multiples en anthropologie, en sociaux, en histoire, en géographie, en ethno et en archéologie. Alors, habituellement et traditionnellement, en fait, pour moi, enfin, c'est vraiment très, très schématique. On a des sources qui sont soit issues de terrains d'enquête, on a des photos de terrain, on a des sources anciennes, on a des cartes anciennes, des documents anciens, des archives, etc. Et puis en bas, on a aussi maintenant des sources numériques. Et donc on verra comment tout ça reboucle dans une espèce de cercle intéressant qui permet de faire reboucler la recherche. Ensuite, derrière, on fait des explorations. Et puis derrière, il y a encore la partie de valorisation. On va déposer nos données. On va vouloir les publier, soit en open access, avec des open éditions. Il faut que ce soit faire. Il faut maintenant, dans certaines revues, que la science soit reproductible. Donc il faut, dans un premier temps, déposer cette donnée, déposer les algorithmes qui vont permettre de générer des figures et montrer que oui, on a bien les résultats. Et ensuite, on va publier des papiers de données. Donc vous voyez, en fait, ces grosses barrières, voilà, c'est des grandes frontières avec aussi des contraintes. Aujourd'hui, depuis que je suis devenu délégué à la protection des données à TSE, je vois. Alors, je ne sais pas si vous y êtes confrontés, mais voilà, il y a une réglementation qui est vraiment très stricte, qui impose beaucoup de contraintes. Et à ce moment-là, quand on part sur le terrain, c'est pour ça que c'est situé sur la partie field survey, eh bien, on ne peut pas partir sur le terrain tant qu'on n'a pas eu le cachet du service du CNRS pour dire vous avez le feu vert et vous allez pouvoir mener votre enquête. Donc ça, c'est une énorme contrainte. Moi, en tant qu'ingénieur, j'essaie de lever ces frontières, d'essayer qu'il y ait une sorte de perméabilité entre tout ça et de lever les contraintes et de casser les frontières. Alors on a parlé des données. Pour moi, les données, une autre frontière, une autre difficulté, c'est que les données en humanité numérique, elles ressemblent un petit peu à ça. C'est-à-dire on reconnaît des formes. En fait, en réalité, elles sont complètement trouées. On dirait du gruyère. Donc elles sont fragmentées. Il y a des trous, il y a des données manquantes, incomplètes. Elles sont hétérogènes, en plusieurs langues, avec un mix entre qualitatif et quantitatif, non structuré, non standardisé. On a des problèmes de modélisation du temps. Les objets changent dans le temps de manière discontinue, puis éventuellement changent de nom, changent de forme, reviennent à une ancienne forme. Donc, le cas des bâtiments, par exemple, notamment ici à Paris, on a eu un projet intéressant. Et puis, je l'évoquais, là, cette frontière qui est intéressante à mobiliser. C'est justement cette frontière entre quantitatif et qualitatif. C'est quelque chose qui est pas encore vraiment très bien maîtrisé. Là où je suis, à TSE, à l'école d'économie de Toulouse, ils ont même un institut qui est l'IAST, l'institut avancé, une sorte de HESS à la sauce économiste, où ils accueillent des sociologues et des anthropologues, mais uniquement sur des méthodes quantitativistes. Ils ne s'intéressent pas forcément à tout ce qui est qualitatif. Et je pense qu'il y a vraiment quelque chose à faire pour tenter d'imbriquer quantitatif et qualitatif. Et ça va passer par les données. Donc j'ai tenté là de synthétiser ça avec les données structurées, qui sont plutôt habituellement des données quanti, voire des données semi-structurées, et puis il y a un dialogue qui va s'installer entre les données non structurées, hein, jusqu'à des carnets, des plans, des choses comme ça, et puis à tenter de faire se rencontrer des choses. Alors pour faire tout ça, eh bien on a en tant qu'ingénieur un arsenal qu'on tente de représenter ici comme une espèce de table de Mendeleïev, avec des outils, des méthodes. Vous voyez, c'est bien fait, hein, c'est un collègue qui a fait ça, Antoine Courtin. Il y a des belles couleurs, on peut partager sa recherche, il y a des outils ad hoc. On va pouvoir exploiter ou révéler ces données, gérer des données avec des outils d'humanité numérique. On va vouloir les publier, les visualiser. Tout ce qu'il y a en bleu, c'est la partie métaux lourds, on va dire. C'est tout ce qui est informatique. Donc c'est tout ce qui est programmation, avec, vous voyez, aussi un niveau de difficulté de prise en main aisée vers des prises en main beaucoup plus compliquées. Alors, le problème de tout ça, c'est que pour les humanistes, moi je ressens que souvent il y a un effet boîte noire. Voilà, on rentre quelque chose, on va sortir quelque chose, ce qui se passe au milieu, charge à l'ingénieur de se débrouiller avec ça et de faire quelque chose. Et ça, pour moi, c'est un problème, parce que ça remet à une place très technique le travail d'ingénieur, où on va lui, voilà, il maîtrise tout ça. Une fois qu'il maîtrise tout ça, bon, fais-moi quelque chose, construis-moi un outil qui fait, voilà, qui prend ça et qui sort autre chose. Et en définitive, en fait, ce qui se passe, c'est que dans cette boîte noire, c'est pas du tout une boîte noire. Derrière, il y a des maths, il y a des modèles, il y a de l'analyse du signal, il y a de l'algorithmie avec des structures de données complexes. Il faut connaître le code. Et aujourd'hui, alors cette partie, elle n'est pas forcément très représentative, mais on va dire que c'est la partie intelligence artificielle, c'est les réseaux de neurones, c'est l'apprentissage qui prend une ampleur assez importante. Et c'est pour cette raison que là, je montrais que la courbe des publications en humanité numérique aujourd'hui s'infléchit, parce que de plus en plus, le mot-clé, on va dire le mot-clé à la mode, c'est plus forcément humanité numérique, ça va être artificial intelligence. Alors, alors, en plus de tout ça, il y a des aspects légaux qui prennent du temps à gérer, hein, tous les aspects quand on est contraint par des financements ANR ou ERC, ou même régionaux. Voilà, il y a tout un tas de contraintes. On est obligé d'anticiper sur les data management plans, les plans de gestion des données. Est-ce qu'on utilise des données sensibles? Et puis ensuite, comme on est payé par des institutions publiques, eh bien on doit publier ces données avec encore d'autres contraintes. Donc on parle ici d'open science. Alors, et comme si ce n'était pas assez compliqué, là, l'idée, hein, en tant qu'ingénieur, c'est de tenter de dénouer tout ça. Eh bien, il y a tout un tas de structures, en tout cas que j'ai tenté d'identifier en France, et je sais qu'il y en a pas mal ailleurs, qui tentent, comme moi, mais chacun à son petit niveau, de mailler un réseau d'acteurs qui s'intéressent à ça, mais c'est pas forcément évident. Alors, pour finir, hein, voilà, pour moi, les humanités numériques, bah, c'est comme une espèce de pont en train de se construire, dans lequel doivent converger tout un tas de choses. Vous voyez ici le Tokyo Gate Bridge en train de se construire. Je crois que c'est en 2010. La photo a l'air, en noir et blanc, a l'air plus ancienne. J'ai parlé de frontières, donc c'est aussi l'idée de réunir des frontières, de réunir des rives, une vision technique et puis une vision scientifique, mais pas forcément. Donc il y a vraiment quelque chose à construire de manière plus large, dans une vision, on va dire, stratégique, mais aussi structurelle, dans les institutions, miser énormément sur l'interdisciplinarité, tout le monde l'a dit. L'excellence, la transmission, ce sera aussi peut-être quelque chose à discuter. Comment on transmet, comment on enseigne les humanités numériques aujourd'hui, de manière à faire converger les connaissances, les partager les méthodologies, les données et les publications. Merci.
Okay, thank you. So I'm also I'll talk about collaboration, but I'll also put it again into the context of Humanité numérique, or the digital republic, as Aleksandra has given us in there as a bit of a brief as well. And I just want to start off by situating, Aleksandra mentioned that I work between history and design research. And this is going to be very, very important for what I'm going to say. So I'll briefly sort of situate these practices, talk about collaboration in those practices, and then give an example of a project that I'm involved in that really brings to the fore some really interesting opportunities and challenges around collaboration, including legal challenges, and also I think points to some of the exciting, I suppose, digital sort of ruptures of boundaries in the digital that Éric was just talking about. So as a historian, I would describe myself as I suppose a social historian who thinks about technology, but with a focus on power relations, on affordances, and on experience. So how people experience the actual sort of activities of creating technical systems or operating them or deciding to implement them. And I also, however, am situated within design research, and I work with and within design research. So with design researchers within the modes of both history and design research. And I mention this because collaboration operates very, very differently in these two worlds. Historically, although as Rebekah has presented, these are beginning to converge. So in history, as Rebekah has set out, there has been so much of a sort of a solo model. And that's obviously beginning to shift quite powerfully, including with a number of projects by people in this room. And I think it's really important to acknowledge how digital tools in communication, in data analysis, in analyzing and accessing archives have enabled us to do that, whether it's bridging distances, to collaborate with people, to access sources, to look at sources, and to work with data in different ways. That said, it's still very often sort of a solitary process. On the other hand, design research is integrally collaborative. So design research as a field incorporates a number of areas, some of which might be communication design or industrial design engineering. It could also be service design. It could also be design methods and the application of design methods from engineering or from design disciplines into broader systems challenges. So working more at the level of systems thinking or policy design. And if you think about designers or what I've just described, those are integrally, inherently collaborative processes, where a designer would be collaborating in industry, say, with manufacturers and clients. In design research, that expectation of collaboration remains, and design research is also very heavily influenced by both social sciences and natural sciences. So multiple authors, co-authors, is absolutely ordinary. We actually have expectations for publishing levels or publishing quantities that require co-authorship, because there's no other way to publish sufficiently to be able to meet the expectations of our institutions. So there's a very, very different model, and there's also a different model, and I think I'd love to talk about this, just the shifts in the past decade really around power and knowledge holding, so that in design research, and I operate quite heavily in an area that we'd call social design, or design for social innovation, which is very much working with communities who might be policymakers, they might be local residents, they might be industry peak bodies, it could be varieties of people. But we can't as researchers say that we own the knowledge, and we need to, it's very much around acknowledging the position that we have as researchers collaborating with communities who are themselves the knowledge holders, and facilitating people to bring their knowledge and to create new knowledge together, but to be very careful about the positionality that we have, which leads to a situation in which it's very difficult actually to talk about research on something. So even, for example, the title, vers un siècle de recherche en sciences sociales sur le Japon. I see the sur and I get nervous, because in design research we can't talk about sur or on, it's with. And so it's I think, you know, and this is part of a variety of things. It's part of that social practice within design. It's also part, obviously, of a shift to a more decolonial practice, and of trying to acknowledge traditional knowledge holders or acknowledge power relations, and to try and, I think, bring some humility to the practices that we have as academics. So within all of that, there's one further level, which is just sort of, I suppose, where historians operate. And as we break down those boundaries, Éric, you spoke about being a computer scientist within the humanities. I'm a humanities researcher in a technical university, in which the expectations for research are those of the natural sciences and applied sciences. So one of my metrics for my school, and for me as a researcher, is how many collaborative journal articles have I published each year with my PhD students? Now that brings up huge ethical issues, as Rebekah has shared, and it's something that we sort of wrestle with, and it's something that I wrestle with quite a lot as a historian, because our training models are that the PhD students own their own research rather than in a lab where it's collaborative research. So it's asking all of these ethical questions and these questions about processes and adjustment, which are quite exciting, but at the same time do cause a lot of thinking. So I'll bring this into a project now, because I think also we've been speaking so far very largely about resources that are what we might call born material or born physical. And there's another category of humanité numérique, or digital humanities, or histories, which is with born digital cultural artifacts. Now, if you think about deep time and deep history, and 80,000 years, 80,000 years of people living in what's now known as Australia alone, so very, very long human habitation of this earth, and even longer environmental or planetary history, the digital piece is incredibly small, right? It's an incredibly short period. At the same time, and if we change the scale, it's now been 60 years since the generation of digital data and the use of digital systems has been integral to human social, political, technological, and so on, economic practices. So I've got an image here. This is from the Japanese Computer Museum, and it's very much meant as an indicative image. This is a mainframe built by Hitachi in the mid-1960s, with very much as part of a joint initiative between the Japanese government, a number of particular firms, including Hitachi, and a number of research universities. And I could have picked any mainframe, really. The point is that since the mid-1960s, the generation of digital data and the operations of systems using digital processes has been integral. And we're actually at risk at the moment, globally, of losing a significant amount of historical archives and sources because we don't know how to work with born digital cultural artifacts. right? So it's a sliver in terms of the time, but it's a major element for understanding things like energy transmission, understanding changes in manufacturing practice, understanding supply chain management, understanding weather, understanding sciences. So I'm involved, so there's a major sort of historical challenge here, which isn't, I suppose doesn't get as much attention as, say, the digitization of earlier material or physical artifacts. And of course, born digital cultural heritage, so software, computer programs, these are themselves digital, they're themselves physical artifacts as well. So floppy disks, mainframes, computer tape, all of these physical artifacts. And there's been fantastic research into the maintenance, the stabilization of some of the physical artifacts, but there's still a challenge which is around opening them. So imagine, and this probably applies to most of our research as well. I know I have a stack of 3.5-inch floppy disks sitting in my study, which I can't open at home. And I probably don't need the data on them, but maybe I will, or maybe it would be interesting to go back and find out. And there's another, and my data isn't very interesting, but in some fields, for example, history of industrial processes, history of energy use, history of architecture and the built environment, these become major data for understanding historical moments. So, you might have the file, might have the floppy disks, but you don't have the hardware or the software to open them. And so there's a really a fantastic initiative that I'm involved with at the moment, and I'm feeling very grateful to have been invited to join it when I moved to Australia a few years ago. So a few years ago, a computer science team at the University of Freiburg developed this software, which is called Easy, which is a fantastic tool for emulating. And so it's about preserving, emulating, and providing access to born digital cultural heritage, which could be anything. It could be anything which is a digital format. What it involves is combining the hardware and the software. So say a PC from 1981 with the software used to generate the program, which you then read the floppy disk, the magnetic tape, whatever it is, and then can emulate it in a contemporary computer environment so that you can work with it, not only to open it, but to work with it in the mode that people would have been using it at the time. And if you do something like computing history, or like me, think about sort of the affordances and materialities of practice, then this is incredibly important. So I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. My own work is currently looking at the impact of CAD and other computing systems, sort of ICT, information and communications ICT technology on design professions. So that's partly looking at things like supply chain management as well as within design practice. So this allows me to open files, not just to open files, but to think about someone in a design office in Tokyo in 1983, how would they have worked with this software, which then allows us to do histories of the software and of that sort of experiential, those more experiential social histories as well. So there are a lot of challenges with this. You need to find the hardware, you need to find the software, you need to find all the peripherals, which is incredibly challenging. There are legal challenges in the sense of I might have the computer, you've got the software, you've got the peripherals, you've got the programs. Can we legally combine those materials to access them? So it's a fantastic initiative to be part of. I should say Yale University in the US has spearheaded the initiative with funding from the Mellon Foundation. We now have Australian Research Council funding for the infrastructure in an Australia-wide project with I think 27 partners across Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand, to implement this in Australia as well. And my own work is looking at taking this into Japan. So I will stop there and just, I suppose, stop by saying I think there are sort of interesting challenges coming up when we think about born digital cultural heritage and systems for working with born digital, as well as the fantastic work that we're now able to do in digital humanities, and that brings interesting possibilities and challenges for collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you for exciting ideas and sticking to time, which is not always easy to do. I wanted to come back to a couple of things before opening the floor to general discussion. One thing that seems to come out clearly is this notion of how to give credit, because that sort of impacts the entire structure, right? And I think this speaks to your question, Éric, about the black box and about what it means to be a technician in 21st century collaboration between data and social sciences. And I think that there is something to be explicitly rethought about what it means to be, what is it that technicians do? And I'm no longer even sure that technician is the right word for it. But what I mean to say is that the new standards of practice about how you give credit and how you must give credit, or how you expect it to be to give credit, may be the way of gently nudging the collaborations into the contours that we would like to see in life. Because if you start the collaboration with saying, whatever we do together, thy shall be acknowledged, that's a great way to start, right? And that changes everything. And no one's black box, right? So I wonder whether that in your mind is a one of the ways of thinking about how to structure, how to start structuring collaborations by thinking about credit, gratitude, acknowledgements, and once you start thinking about it, it's not that simple, it's not that straightforward, even in a single institutional context, let alone international context. But I think that's something that comes out of all three talks or three interventions in a certain sense. And Éric used the word frontiers, and he used is a word, a verb. You correct me if I'm wrong. You used the word déceler, and that's a very interesting word because it means unsaddle a horse, right? It's a horseback riding term, and that puts a different spin on the word frontier and the word arsenal. So you use the word arsenal, use the word frontier. And then you use this word about, unsaddling, and I think that's probably the word that I like the best in terms of thinking about what it is that we are doing, because arsenal is great, but I would like us to not go to war if we don't have to, because we're likely in social sciences to lose it against insurance companies and data scientists and banks, right? So maybe doing something a little bit more of destabilizing with the purpose, not necessarily disruption, but just trying to do something differently. Again, starting with specific rules, right? And one of the rules we haven't talked about is the open access rules, right? Which is what separates us from in Europe today, legally, from a lot of what's going on in the United States, and that is my second thing to put on this table. Which is, what does it mean to collaborate internationally today, when the flagship journal in our field does not, I repeat, does not allow open access, period. Which means that the entire European community, which has received any bit of funding from the European Union, which is not a small chunk of us, cannot publish in the top journals in our field anymore, or has to jump through hoops, as Rebekah has done, Not to mention the Japanese journals do the same, right? And so there are some structural barriers with open access that don't seem to have universal traction, and that affects us very, very, very deeply, and affects our capacity to collaborate, frankly. So I would like to hear your thoughts on giving gratitude and acknowledgements for a starter, as a starter to collaboration, and on tensions and structures of open access, particularly in Europe.
Thank you. I don't have an answer to the question of gratitude and and acknowledgements, but I want to raise another problem, and that is that I have found that the larger the number of authors, the more likely it is to be rejected from the journal in first instance. I don't have a very large sample size, but I have a very strong hunch that that's what's going on. And I also suspect that when the name, I won't say what journals, but I think if the name is an Asian name, I think because there's been a lot of pressure on colleagues in Korea and increasingly in Japan to publish in English, I suspect that some journals have an attitude that this may be research that has been published elsewhere and translated into English when they see a large number of author names, and some of those author names are not recognizably Western or whatever, they're East Asian. So I think that something has to be done to change kind of cultural practices and understanding of what collaboration means at the journal level. And I don't really have any answers on how to do that. But the more people you acknowledge on the author list of your article, I think in history, the less likely it is to be read by some of the main journals. But I don't know if that's everyone's experience, but that's what I've noticed.
I think I'm going to go very, very big and then go very small again, because I think what you're both pointing to is the challenges of operating in a globalized scholarly world within very localized cultural practices that are nationally specific or regionally specific. And I was talking about disciplinary differences, right? But I think, what we are talking, right, so, like the open access being something very specifically based here, US publishers who publish some of the key journals in our fields, being based in the US, where the politics or the sort of cultures around open access, with which I should say I'm entirely unfamiliar, except for running into challenges, as you've described, are very, very different. So I think we could be talking about this as the challenges of doing integrated scholarship across global networks when cultural specificity remains. But to take it really, really small again, I really like your point around nudge. And I think it's interesting, I was in a PhD examination this morning and a very similar question actually came up. I'll say it's a public examination and the video will be online. So I think I can talk about it. But the answer, which I thought was excellent, was, well, you do these sort of small practices and think about where you have power and where you can model change. But no, I suppose understanding power relations and hierarchies. So if very senior scholars in our fields collectively began undertaking these practices, or committed to doing that, then we would see change in ways that would be more effective. I suppose the one other thing I'll say, so this is going very long, is that I think it's also about, I suppose, lobbying. So in Australia, we're similarly required to publish open access, again, for industry, for community engagement or sort of ethics. We want to publish open access because otherwise we're asking people to pay $80 or 100 euros or whatever it is to access the work that they contributed to. And, how can you say that, my work will have any usefulness if people aren't going to go looking behind a paywall? So we have a national consortium which negotiates on behalf of all researchers based in Australia with publishers. But because we're heavily science and technology based, most of the journal publishers they negotiate with are in STEM. So it actually doesn't work for Asian studies, and our journals are not included. So there's a kind of disciplinary scale politics at play as well. But then we deal with that by doing very, very specific targeted lobbying about, if you get us access to this journal, here is what will happen, and here is how this will benefit the university. Here is how it will benefit the reputation of Australian science, blah, blah, blah. So, sorry, long answer.
En français. Oui, alors je vais réagir en français, pardon. Je vais essayer d'être assez clair encore une fois. Sur les publications et l'open science et les modèles qui sont en train de se mettre en place. Alors je comprends l'argument économique d'une part, de tendre vers des publications open. Malgré tout, il y a des choses qui sont un peu manquantes du côté des publications en open aujourd'hui. C'est en train de démarrer. Et vous allez voir que du coup, du côté technique, entre guillemets, en tout cas du côté ingénierie, c'est encore intéressant d'aller dans des publications qui ne le sont pas. Je parle de l'expérience que j'ai aujourd'hui avec l'école d'économie de Toulouse, parce qu'il y a une valorisation qui est faite sur les codes et sur les données. C'est-à-dire qu'ils ont des environnements sur lesquels on va pouvoir, comme un peu ce que tu montrais là, répliquer des algorithmes directement dans la revue. C'est validé directement avec la donnée qui est mise en ligne. Alors, ça pose aussi la question à un moment, à savoir à qui appartient la donnée. C'est-à-dire une fois qu'on la dépose sur le site de la revue, on ne sait plus si c'est de l'open data ou pas. Ça pose des questions. Et côté ingénieur, et pour rebondir sur la question que tu me posais sur les crédits et l'acknowledgement et les façons aussi de valoriser un travail, on va dire, méthodologique ou technique ou d'ingénieur. Souvent, moi, je passe beaucoup de temps à écrire du code, ce qui n'est pas forcément écrire un article. Et donc, un moyen de le valoriser dans une revue type payante, c'est mieux valorisé parce que du coup, c'est visible, le code est visible et le code est valorisé, il est même déposé en open source et donc, il peut être réutilisé. Or, aujourd'hui, dans des open publications classiques en humanité, ce travail, on ne le voit pas, il est invisibilisé. Et à propos d'invisible, justement, tu mentionnais la déceler. Et déceler, pour moi, il y a deux formes à déceler. Donc, déceler, c'est bien enlever la selle d'un cheval, c'est ce que tu disais. Mais c'est aussi dévoiler. Et donc, dans ces deux acceptions, en fait, il y a dévoiler, c'est enlever le voile, déceler, c'est enlever la selle, et c'est finalement visibiliser quelque chose. Voilà. Pour moi, c'est deux visions.
Alors peut-être on peut prendre quelques questions dans le public, parce que je pense qu'il y en a pas mal qui vont peut-être réagir.
Quand j'ai parlé de déceler, je pense que je l'utilisais dans le sens de dévoiler, effectivement. La plupart du temps, dans des données, de manière classique, imaginons un tableau Excel, il y a quelque chose, si on a beaucoup de données, il y a des choses qui sont cachées, qu'on a besoin de fouiller, de croiser avec d'autres données éventuellement, donc d'avoir une approche un peu statistique, parfois en croisant avec d'autres bases de données, etc. Donc en croisant toutes ces bases de données, on va révéler la structure cachée de la donnée. Voilà ce que ça voulait dire.
Thank you all. This is a marvelous panel, and I've bookmarked all those great websites, and I'm super excited to use it. I just wanted to flag a couple of things. One, I'm not especially active in our professional organizations, but I think the AAS and related organizations probably have a critical role to play, because what I'm hearing is, and seeing on my side, and I was earlier on, my postdoc was a digital humanities postdoc actually all those years ago when I first got the PhD. And I was told then, that work wouldn't count to tenure. And I don't know that we've changed all that much. And I'm old. So this is a long time ago. And I think, you know, the underlying academic economy, if we want to shift it, it can't really come from within the institutions. I think it probably needs to come at the professional organization level, where folks like us get together, decide that this is something we want to push and seek change. So that's just an observation, and if we're looking for concrete steps, maybe somewhere to go. The other thing I wanted to flag is the differences in the economy, and I'm curious because with practitioners, when I was involved in this kind of work all those years ago, it was something called the Expanding East Asian Studies Project that one of my advisors ran, and it was teaching focused. It was a set of teaching modules, and you can actually find the old website archived on something like EAS Easy, because it's so outdated that it won't even work on most modern browsers. But the economy, the intellectual economy of digital work, how does it differ from the monograph, which is the standard in my subfield, right? I have to publish a book. My colleagues must publish at least one single author monograph that makes an original argument to the field that shifts the direction of research and inquiry. Is that burden the same for digital work, or is it different? And how does that play into how we're thinking about these things? Because there's no question these are valuable, but are we talking about different forms of value as we move forward?
Thank you for your question, and for the idea about talking to AAS. I think that's really inspired. On the question of the value in the digital humanities work, I think it's probably different depending on where you're looking at being assessed. And for people in my group who are doing, so that Stories of Clay exhibition that I did with a Korean collaborator, I think it's more useful for her. I have tenure, so I can do what I like. So that's one answer. If I think it's interesting, if I think it's worthwhile, I obviously still have to do the more traditional things, but not everything has to be. So there's that luxury. But for people who are looking for jobs in Europe or in the UK, teaching is increasingly becoming recognised, I think, as an important part of the way that, for example, in the UK, that they assess a department. They're trying to improve that. And with students becoming increasingly digital themselves, my guess is that is looked upon favourably. Also, impact. This is this thing you have to, in Australia and in the UK, you have to somehow, as a historian, have some kind of impact. And so departments are thinking about that. I don't know about the US tenure system, but I think in the UK it would be valued in that sense. So that's a region-specific answer. I don't know if anyone else.
I mean, the short answer is that unfortunately you are right. In most of our subdisciplines, being history, monograph is the way to go. Right? So I think for some of us, this is something that we do on the side because we cannot help ourselves, right? In certain aspects on the digital, but on collaborations, the most of the kind of thing that you were talking about yesterday, I think that there's a distinction to be made, and this is maybe going to sound a little bit harsh, but bear with me. Having worked on both sides of the ocean, one of the things that occurs to me is that there is a research project that is going to get you tenure, because you know that in X number of years you're going to come up with something that is going to be bookable and that is going to be published. And if you are good, it's going to be well reviewed, you're going to get tenure. Is that the most interesting book that you could have written? Probably not. Is that the most pertinent, most urgent question in the field that we could have answered? Maybe not. But that's not its job. It's not meant to do that. It's meant to get you tenure. So you write that book, you get that tenure, and then you say, well, here are the other 4 questions that I was really, really interested in, but everyone told me I should not go down that way, right? Because it's too risky, right? And I think that that's not going to probably change anytime soon. Maybe it will, but that's okay, right? We should. Weren't we advised to think about our career as a book of many chapters? So there is survive a PhD chapter, there is get tenure chapter, and there is like the rest of my life chapter, right? And one of the things that we could do in the rest of our life chapter is you know, do risky stuff, do collaborative stuff, and then as if we are senior people on the project, take the blame, take the hit if it doesn't work, because it's okay. I mean, we're all tenured, we can do that, but that opens path for something good coming out of it. And maybe this is like too lyrical, but it is. This is how I think about it at present. So in other words, it's just not because it's difficult or because it's complicated. It's probably going to misfire. It's probably going to backfire. But at this stage of my life, with my career, not having that many years ahead, not many decades ahead, I'm thinking, so what do I have to lose in trying, right? So that's why. That doesn't mean we're going to think through how, but I'm like, yeah, let's try to do this better in the next round, and maybe make it possible for our students to be able to say, well, I'm just going to make this really interesting thing about ceramics and get tenure on that.
Can I? Oops, sorry. I think there's from what you've said and sort of following on some of the discussion, I suppose that, you know, my provocation would be, what's the point of doing history to replicate the existing forms of ways of doing history that require tenure and blah 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 blah? And you know, oh no, it's getting a salary, but I suppose, like, you know, beyond the individual interest, right? You know, like that's, you know, there's a kind of replication of the existing, as you've said, even though it might not be the most interesting or the most useful for your students or the most ethical, you know, the most, you know, effective way to, you know, live one's values through what you do, if that's something you're interested in. So I suppose I would, you know, I would give a bit of a shout out for other way, and I think this is where things like the impact, just, you know, the incorporation of impact into the UK research assessment, and places like Australia as well, where actually those other things that we do are really counted. And they have all sorts of problems, and, you know, and people work with the system in very, very odd ways, but it does mean that you can think about what is the public value of your work, or what is the public contribution of the work, in some very, very different ways. I mean, I say that as an advocate of, I think, what we called on the RCA V&A course, public-facing practice-based history. And it was quite interesting, the number of students who we had who'd come out of traditional history undergraduate programs who didn't want to do that replicating work. You know, they wanted to apply history ways of working into all sorts of areas, and it was really interesting when we reframed the program that way, sort of what happened as a result.
Peut-être réagir sur les nouveaux moyens de faire de l'histoire, notamment de publier des monographies ou des publications, en tout cas qui ont une valeur ajoutée. On est en train de travailler à un projet. Alors, il y a du bon et il y a du moins bon. Le moins bon, c'est que ça prend du temps de construire cette valeur ajoutée. Et notamment, la valeur ajoutée, c'est de dire, voilà, on a une monographie, et là, en l'occurrence, ça va être une étude sur les maisons médiévales en Espagne, à Tolède. Et l'idée, ça va être de connecter ça à des annuaires de noms de lieux, mais aussi à des bases de données anthroponymiques. Et donc, on va pouvoir croiser ça. Alors, l'idée, c'est que derrière, il y a aussi des modèles à base d'ontologie, donc des graphes qui vont pouvoir se connecter. Et l'idée, c'est que dans l'avenir, on va pouvoir connecter toutes ces monographies un jour les unes avec les autres, et donc d'imaginer des inférences, donc des moyens d'interroger avec des rebonds successifs et donc d'ouvrir encore plus largement et de faire des recherches croisées, on va dire. Et donc le premier moyen, ça va être effectivement cette chose-là, et puis il y a des possibilités derrière, encore une fois, de data analyse sur ces choses, enfin sur cette monographie devient de la donnée qui est interrogeable intelligemment, puisqu'on va pouvoir positionner les lieux, avoir automatiquement des personnes qui vont être référencées de manière collaborative et éventuellement, enfin ce genre de choses. Donc il y a des choses, il y a une plus-value, mais tout ça, habituellement une monographie, c'est quelques années pour être publiée. Là, le temps d'annoter tout ça, c'est encore quelques années de plus. Voilà, on peut doubler le temps pour une publication de ce genre.
So what Eric was talking about, deep publishing, right, and basically augmented publishing. And the possibilities of doing that. And one of the problems that he mentioned is that it takes double the time that it takes to produce the monograph, in which, so indefinitely not do this for tenure. But one of the liberating things about collaboration outside of our field is that we are one of the last bastions in social sciences, one of the last disciplines that is focused on book manuscript. And so there is a huge pool of people out there who have no problem collaborating with us. So once we we historians, that's what the historians get over this thing that has been inculcated into us, which is like, you do your archives, then you write your articles, and you know, it's solitary work, right? So once we sort of internally get over it, there are museum people and local historians and a whole bunch of people who are actually eager to collaborate. Now then you enter into the mechanics of collaboration and how you do that and how you do that transdiscipline, and that's hard work. It's not easy, and it probably never will be acknowledged how much work it takes into getting things done, but it's also one of the ways of collaborating. I'm going to benefit just to relate one anecdote that we had in our many conversations with Éric, which is has to do with thinking about data in social sciences. And at some point we were talking about this, how come did the constructing data from one generation of historians to another generation of historians is not something that we're thinking about. And you would think we as historians would think about how to transmit our data to the next coming generation, but we actually don't. And then Éric said to me something along the lines, but like, you can't do cancer research if you don't build on the fellow before and the fellow ahead, right? Because it's cumulative. Science is cumulative. And I was like, but we too are cumulative. Yes, except that our data is not designed to be so at the meta level, or at the basic level, I think there is a question historians may ask themselves about cumulativity. Like, how do I make sure that the data that's behind the monograph doesn't disappear when my hard disk dies, right? And can be used by someone else who may ask completely different questions of that data, which is something that we are now finding out. But that kind of like continuity, right, beyond one generation. And obviously economic history, you would think that they got this better, but I don't know how many times I've heard from Todai, Keizai, Gakubu people that, yes, that data, we had it on Professor so-and-so's hard disk, but then he retired and no one ever recovered the data. And this is like patent data, so it's not even like something very, so you have to get a new kaken, get new people on board, do the same kind of thing. And I'm like, we are wasting time here. There should be something better and smarter to do some of the basic research.
It strikes me that that's a question of incentives. There's very little incentive in the humanities for sharing underlying data. In fact, there's a counter incentive because someone will scoop you. And those articles that we value over and against creating new knowledge will be less likely to have your name when we have a sole author model. So again, this comes back, I do think professional organizations have a role to play in creating standards and normalizing them. in the social sciences, creating a data set that is widely used is part of a recognized scholarly achievement. And to a certain degree, what I see on these marvelous projects is doing something similar, and I think it probably does get credit, but we haven't formalized it yet, and we really need to create some very explicit hierarchies if we want to see that change.
My funding comes from the ERC's Horizon 2020, which is the previous subvention, but yours is 2020. Well, Horizon Europe, which is the current round of funding, that has the requirement for open data. So Horizon 2020, we were encouraged, but I don't know about you, but I didn't. You signed up. I didn't sign up because I thought, I don't know what this is and I don't know how to do it. As it happens, my data, that database that I showed you is downloadable. The whole thing can be downloaded from the open access repository of my university. Or the previous version, I have to add the current version. But so maybe you can speak to that, because now this is an incentive that if you get this money, you have to make your data available. And I believe it's not at the beginning of the grant. I mean, it's once you've finished and started publishing and getting credit. So
I clicked the wrong checkbox, so I opted in. But joking aside, the incentive is there. And it's not even an incentive, it's like a legal obligation to do so. And the only thing you can play with is when is it that you do it. So there is a certain pressure to publish on the data before it becomes publicly available. And that's a science model, right? So you do observations, you do by a time, telescope time, you get your observations, you have 6 months to publish, and if you don't, well, then it goes into automatically into. So I think it's a bit of that model. So in Europe, we are actually going to be in this situation. We are in this situation already, right? But that's where the digital republic comes in. Now, how we get taken up by our US colleagues who have no incentive to do the same, right, and to pitch into the same pool is a different story.
The word that's lurking behind is IP. I think just intellectual property, and we don't talk about intellectual property of social scientists. And I'm thinking about this because I'm in the middle of various research contracts with collaborators and industry partners, and for my PhD students, and sorry, not between me and the PhD student, but the PhD student and their collaborators. And we always talk about IP. Who brings the background IP? Who owns the IP generated? What is the IP generated? And we need to specify. And it's been such a steep learning curve because we're not trained to think that way. But what we're talking about is IP, and who owns the IP, and what is the IP that we generate as historians. And thinking about the knowledge, you could say the data isn't our knowledge. It's data that existed. The IP is that we've aggregated it, and then we interpret it. That's the labor that we do. So it's more of a sort of theoretical, jet-laggy thought, I suppose, but I do think that the language of IP could be helpful for clarifying some of these things before we take them to the AAS and the other peak bodies.
I don't want to speak about AAS, but AAS knows. I mean, we had many conversations with them, but they sort of know, but so far that's not a burning issue for them.
Thank you so much for all your presentations. I thought it was really inspiring, but I still have a question because I'm not a historian, and I'm just wondering if you had some thought about how you can collaborate when your work involves living people and field work, and as well as your body on the field site. And maybe I was thinking that maybe Éric could have maybe some examples of collaboration or like using and sharing the data and etc. Thank you.
En français. Alors, ouais, je rebondis aussi sur ce qui était dit précédemment, à savoir les obligations légales donc de déposer la donnée. On s'engage sur un ANR ou un RC à déposer cette donnée. Et là, dans ce cas-là, quand il y a du travail de terrain, donc d'aujourd'hui, quand on va sur le terrain, peut-être au contact d'enquêter, on est obligé de remplir un formulaire de RGPD. Et moi, j'en vois passer beaucoup en ce moment. Et on doit s'engager dans un formulaire de RGPD de dire ces données que je vais collecter, je vais être obligé de les supprimer avec un délai. On ne peut pas dire je vais les garder indéfiniment. Donc, ça va à l'encontre de dire on est en open data et en même temps, on doit supprimer les données. Là, il y a un problème. Voilà. Un exemple, là, il y a une chercheuse qui... Alors, j'ai fait une formation RGPD récemment et le seul objectif du CNRS dans ces cas-là, c'est de protéger la personne, de protéger l'identité des personnes. Une collègue à l'IAST qui travaille en Chine, alors on est dans un projet un peu fou, elle veut filmer des enfants dans des cours d'école. En Chine, déjà. Alors, vous imaginez la tête de l'agent de sécurité. Pour essayer de détecter, en gros, est-ce qu'il y a une transmission entre leaders et followers dès l'enfance jusqu'à l'âge adulte. Donc là, le service des PD du CNRS, il saute au plafond. Enfin, donc il faut anonymiser. Elle garantit qu'elle ne recevra qu'une matrice. Mais comment ? Je suis sûr qu'une fois que la publication sera faite, on pourra très bien identifier les écoles. Voir comment c'est fait. Ensuite, il faut vérifier la loi chinoise. Est-ce que ces données comment elles seront conservées? Est-ce que ce sera chiffré sur l'ordinateur de qui? Sur quel serveur? Enfin, tout ça est très compliqué. Et donc, pour l'instant, là, on est complètement coincé sur quelque chose comme ça, quoi. C'est très compliqué.
I might just note that this does come up when doing history as well, partly because history is entangled with communities and knowledge holders as well, who are archive holders, but also knowledge holders. And so I think a lot of the questions that come out in some of the social sciences around, like anthropology and geography are very, very live when you work in, but even, if I work with material from 100 years ago, I'm working with the grandchildren of those people, right? Or if I work with companies and company archives, or local governments, there's still an investment. So all of these questions and I think one way is to talk about it and to reflect on it. So certainly, I think, reflecting on one's positionality, I was very uncomfortable saying I, but I'm also now, I try and be very clear about sort of where I'm coming from and, what are the limits of me. And so that acknowledging the situated nature is, I think, really important.
I think our coffee is getting cold. And so I would like to thank everyone for brilliant brainstorming about all the things we can and cannot do, but may be able to in the future. Thank you for helping us bring to a nice close. And I suggest we go back to at 4:30 for the next panel on cartography.